AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So it's a technique for making your web pages more responsive. So instead of going for the theory of AJAX, let's understand what it's used for. AJAX is used for partially updating a page without refreshing the full page. What does that mean? So let's see the difference between a post request or a normal page request and an AJAX request. So here is a basic page I created. It just has two fields and a submit button. So what happens when we press the submit button? So when we press the submit button, all the form values are submitted and the server goes through the JSF lifecycle, and this is what we get. This is the rendered response. So over here, first of all, in our JSF lifecycle, which happens on the server, a request tree gets formed. The values submitted over here are entered in their respective components. Then validation is performed, then the model gets updated, then the command button action gets invoked, and finally the response is rendered, which is over here and which is shown over here. So this is a normal post request where all the form values are submitted and the server responds with some HTML code. So let's see how different an AJAX request is. So over here I've shown an AJAX request. In AJAX, we can decide which fields we want to send. So for example, here we just send the first field. So for the post request, the entire fields of the form get submitted, whereas in AJAX, we get to choose which fields we want to send. And then after we decide which parameters exactly we want to send, the server goes through the JSF lifecycle, which is over here. So over here in the second stage, only this field or this component gets updated. This doesn't get updated because we decided to send only this value. So as the request was partial, the response is also partial. This is not HTML code. This is some XML code saying that what components need to change in what way. It doesn't say that change all the components. It just says that change this component this way. For example, it can say that change the submit value to submit something else, or change the text of this field to something else. So all changes are mentioned over here. And you do not need to understand what this code is. This is all handled internally by JSF runtime. All the plumbing is done by JSF. So let's first study the post request, and later on we'll see the AJAX request. So here is the page, and here's the Firebug panel which is already open. I open the net tab, and over here all has been selected, and let's submit this page. So here is the request which has been sent. If you open this, if you go to the post tab, this was sent. So animal type is nothing because we didn't specify anything over here, and animal total is 0 by default. So this is what was sent, and here's the response, which is the rendered response of this face. So let's correct this. Let's make it cat, and over here let's type some other number, and let's clear this out first, and let's submit the page again, and this post has been sent. So this time we sent both the values, and the response is again the HTML rendered page. So let's now understand an AJAX request. So for AJAX, I've done some changes in the page which we'll see later on, but right now just see what is the request and response. So I just click over here, and I'll just tab out of this field like this, and we get the validation error. We didn't submit the page, I just tabbed out of this field. Now let's understand the request and response when the AJAX request gets sent. So over here, if you go to the post tab, the animal type is nothing because we didn't type anything over here. And let's see the response. The response is not HTML, but it's a partial response which says that only modify this H message tag. So that's the only thing which changes in this page, nothing else changes. So let's see the difference between a post request and an AJAX request. So the only difference is I've added this line inside of input text tag. So this is the AJAX component. Now let's first consider the execute attribute. Now execute says that which values we want to send. For example, in our post request, when we submitted the form, all the fields in the form got submitted, whereas in AJAX we decided that we only want to send animal type. So over here we mention what things we want to send. So we are just sending this input text field. Now render specifies the component whose values we are interested in showing on the page. For example, over here the message component, which is related to this text field, we are only interested in showing the modified value of this message component. So that's what we mentioned over here for the render attribute. Now, in a normal post request, the request got submitted when you click the submit button, which is the command button over here. Whereas in Ajax, you can decide when exactly you want to send the post request. So here I'm mentioning that I want to send the request when we blur out of the text field. So over here, when I blur out of this field, the request gets submitted. For example, I go back to this page and I just tab out of this field and the response was submitted. This is the second post request. And the entire form doesn't get submitted. We decide what we want to send using the execute attribute. Now for the execute attribute, instead of specifying the surrounding input text tag, we could have mentioned this. So add this exactly means the same. So we are saying that execute the surrounding component, whatever it is. So whatever component is the surrounding component gets submitted. Now for the render attribute, instead of specifying just this message, if we wanted to display the entire form again or render the entire form again, we could have mentioned something like this at form, which would have re-rendered the entire form again. Now let's understand the special keywords used for execute and render. So over here I've shown the 4 keywords which we can use for execute and render attributes. Now submitted is applicable for execute attribute and rendered is applicable for the render attribute. For example, if I specify all for execute, it means that every component on the page is submitted, and if I specify all for render attribute, it means that every component on the page is rendered. Now if we mention form for execute, it means that the surrounding form gets executed, or basically all the form values are submitted to the server. And if we specify form for render, it means that the entire form gets re-rendered again. Now this, if we apply to the execute attribute, it means that only the surrounding parent component is submitted. For example, over here, when we applied this over here, only the surrounding component, which is the input text, gets submitted, only its value gets submitted. And if we apply this to the render attribute, it means that only the surrounding parent component gets rendered. So for example, if we had mentioned this over here, that means only the value of this would have been modified, which is not the case we wanted. We wanted to redisplay the message field which contains the error, right? So even though this over here wouldn't have displayed this message, but if we have form as the value, the message gets displayed because this message lies within the form. And none means that nothing is submitted or rendered, and all means that every component in the page is submitted or rendered. So the default attribute for execute is this, and for render it's none. So since the default value is this for execute, we could have easily removed this and the result would have been the same. Now let's, instead of applying this Ajax tag to our input text, let's apply it to a command button. So over here, let's place the Ajax tags inside this. So before that, let's create place for that tag, and let's copy this over here, Control X and this, and let's change the event to click instead of blur. So if we had not mentioned this, what would have happened is a normal post request, but since we have mentioned the Ajax as a child component to a command button, it means that when we click this button, an Ajax request is going to be sent and not a normal post request. So what gets sent is decided by this tag. So execute will decide what is going to be sent, and render is going to decide what gets displayed back, and the event is going to happen when we click this button. So let's enter an execute attribute of form. So basically we are saying that we want to send the entire values of the form and we want to render back the entire form. And now when we run this example, let me clear this out first, and when we click the submit button, a Ajax request gets sent, not a normal post request. How should we verify that? We can see the output over here. So the response is not the HTML page but a partial response. So since execute has been given the value of form, the entire form got submitted. If you see the post tab, all the fields of the form were submitted, and since the render is also mentioned as a form, what we got back is the entire form re-rendered. And since the message tag lies within the form, it also got re-displayed. Now instead of click, we could have mentioned action over here and it would have meant the same thing. However, the default value for event is context sensitive. Only when the Ajax tag is within a command button or any kind of command controls, then only the event attribute has a default value of action. However, if this Ajax tag was over here and we didn't specify the event attribute, then the default value for event would have been value change instead of action. It's context sensitive. Now let's see which events can be applied to which components. This I displayed in two screens. This is the first screen and this is the second screen. Now the common pattern is for all the command controls like command button and command link, the default event attribute is action. So if we don't specify event, the default is action. And for all the input components like input secret, input text, text area, and all the select tags over here, their default event is value change. So we can listen for key down, key press, double click events, value change events, and so on.